The first light of dawn painted the fields in golden hues as Caleb Turner, a widowed farmer in his late 50s, stepped out of his farmhouse. The air was crisp with early autumn chill, and a faint mist clung to the tall grass that bordered his property. He cradled a thermos of coffee in one hand and had a well-worn flannel jacket draped over his shoulder. The farm had been his whole life since his wife passed 5 years ago, and routine was the only thing that kept the silence bearable. As he made his way toward the barn to start the morning chores, something caught his attention. The big red door, which he always made a point of latching each night, was cracked open just a few inches. That wasn't like him. He narrowed his eyes and picked up his pace. The creaking of the hinges echoed in the still morning as he slowly pushed the door open. At first, he didn't see anything. The inside was still dark, the sunlight not yet spilling fully in. Then, in the dim light, he spotted movement, small shapes stirring in the hay. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He stepped inside, alert, one hand instinctively gripping the handle of the shovel leaning against the doorframe. As his eyes adjusted, the shapes became clearer. 7 children, all of them bundled together in a makeshift pile of hay and old horse blankets. They were fast asleep, tired, hungry looking, their clothes dirty and torn. The oldest couldn't have been more than 14, the youngest was barely a toddler curled up in the crook of the oldest girl's arm. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. Then he saw her. Just beyond the children, half covered in an old tarp, lay a woman. She looked to be in her early 30s, though exhaustion and bruises aged her. A gash on her forehead had dried blood caked around it, and her hands were wrapped around her middle as if protecting something unseen. Her eyes fluttered open as Caleb stepped closer. Panic flashed across her face. She tried to push herself up, but Winston dropped back down. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "don't call the police. They'll take my kids." Caleb slowly lowered the shovel to the ground and raised his hands slightly, showing he meant no harm. "Easy now," he said, voice low and steady. "Ain't nobody gonna take anyone. You're safe here, I promise." The woman blinked rapidly, fighting tears and pain. "We had nowhere else to go. I just needed a place for them to sleep. Just one night." He knelt beside her, brushing a bit of straw from her tangled hair. "What's your name?" "Lena," she murmured. "These your kids?" She nodded slowly. He looked at them, still sleeping peacefully in the hay, unaware that their fate hung on the man kneeling beside them. Caleb didn't hesitate. "All right," he said gently. "Let's get you to the house. You need a doctor, and those kids need breakfast." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You'd help us, just like that." Caleb lifted her carefully into his arms. She winced but didn't protest. "Just like that," he said. "No one should sleep in a barn, not like this. Not in my town, not on my land." As he carried her out into the rising sun, the children began to stir, blinking sleep from their eyes as they watched the stranger carry their mother toward safety. Caleb didn't look back. He just walked steady toward the farmhouse, already making plans in his mind. For food, for medicine, for answers. 3 days later, the town was buzzing in a way it hadn't in years. At Maggie's diner, the unofficial heart of the small community, every booth was full, and every conversation circled around one name, Caleb Turner. The bell above the door jingled each time someone entered, and the clatter of coffee cups and forks on plates was barely audible over the constant chatter. Locals leaned in, close, lowering their voices not out of privacy, but out of awe. No one had expected this. Caleb had always been the quiet, keep-to-himself type. After his wife passed, he spoke only when necessary. He farmed his land, went to the feed store, paid his bills on time, and kept a Bible by the window with a pressed daisy in the middle. People respected him, but few truly knew him. Now, everyone wanted to know what had happened. Sheriff Myers sat at the counter, a half-eaten slice of cherry pie in front of him, shaking his head as he recounted the story for the 3rd time that morning. "I'm telling you, he didn't even hesitate," the sheriff said, taking a sip of coffee. "Didn't call me, didn't panic. He called Doc Irwin first, then Marcia over at Social Services, but told her to sit tight, said he wasn't handing anyone over until he knew what was what." From a nearby booth, Pastor Ellis leaned forward. "He kept all 8 of them at his place. Still is," the sheriff replied. "Took the woman, Lena, to the clinic himself. Paid cash for everything. Told Doc Irwin, no bills to her name. She's got enough weight on her back." Maggie, the diner's owner, shook her head in disbelief. "Lord have mercy. That barn's got holes in the roof, and Caleb's barely scraped by these last few years. And now he's feeding 8 mouths. He's feeding them better than most of us feed ourselves," the sheriff said. Drove into town with a list longer than a city receipt. Groceries, blankets, shoes, toothbrushes for all the kids. And get this, he's been sleeping on the couch so they can have the bedrooms. A silence settled briefly over the diner as everyone absorbed the weight of what they were hearing. Then the bell over the door jingled again. Heads turned. Caleb stepped inside, dressed in clean jeans and a freshly ironed shirt, the same flannel jacket slung over his shoulder. Behind him walked Lena, her forehead now bandaged, her posture stronger. Her hair had been brushed back neatly, and her hands were holding the smallest of her children, barely a year old, who clung to her like a lifeline. The other 6 kids filed in behind them, cleaned up and blinking at the sudden attention. They were wearing mismatched clothes donated by neighbors or brought in quietly by church folk who had heard the whispers and wanted to help. The entire diner stood still. No one spoke for a moment. Then a man near the counter began to clap. Slowly, others joined in. Applause filled the room, not loud and raucous, but warm, deep, and reverent. Caleb shifted awkwardly, unsure of what to do, clearly uncomfortable in the spotlight. He tipped his hat slightly in thanks and made his way to an empty table, guiding Lena and the children into seats. Someone shouted, "Their meal's on me." And another called out, "Mine too." Laughter bubbled up, a lightness spreading through the room like sunshine after a storm. The sheriff stood and raised his cup in a quiet toast. Caleb Turner didn't just give a woman and her children a roof. He gave them a reason to believe again. And reminded the rest of us what kindness really looks like. Caleb, now seated with Lena beside him and a child curled against his arm, looked up. His voice was soft, but it carried. "All I did was open a door." The room fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't shock or surprise, it was respect. A man who had once carried his own grief in silence had now become a refuge for others. And in doing so, he had stirred something deep in the heart of the town. No one would forget what he had done.